Hey friends, in this part of the SvelteKit series, we're going to be learning how to create API endpoints and loading data for pages in SvelteKit. So here I have a simple SvelteKit project which at this point you already should know how to make, and I just have some default styles, so you can go to your app HTML, and here I have included some Pico CSS styles, which you can include yourself if you want, and then I have some global styles, which is apps.css. And then I just have a root layout here where I'm importing the styles, and I have some basic navigation here, and that's basically it. If you want to catch up and you don't have this project set up and here's nothing special, just say hello, and then you can go and run the development server. So I can say npm run dev, and now we can go to 5173 and everything should look great. Before I get started, I'm going to set up a database with Prisma, and Prisma is really awesome because it basically, instead of writing raw SQL, you're going to write something more that looks like TypeScript. And this is a schema in Prisma, which you can look at this example here. Here is how you define a table in your database. You can just say model post and etc. And this is really simpler than writing raw SQL yourself. For database, I'm going to use SQLite, which is really awesome because you don't have to set up anything. It's just a file on your system, meaning you don't have to figure out for an hour how to set up a database or sign up for things you really don't care about. And I'm also going to show you how to seed your database. So we're going to use some placeholder data from dummy JSON. So here it has 30 posts for us. By default, when you open the API, so we can look here, here are the posts. So we're going to input that into our database just so we have some data to work with. But yeah, let me close this and let's get started. So I can go here, I can press Ctrl C to stop our development server, Ctrl L to clear everything. Now let's start and initialize the Prisma database. So I can say pnpx Prisma init, and this is mostly just going to be a speedrun how to set up Prisma. So we can use data source provider. This is really an awesome and quick way to set up SQLite with Prisma, providing this flag. So we can just say enter, and this should take a second. And if you look here, what happened, this created a Prisma folder with our schema. So you can really ignore this part at the top. We're going to write our schema here, and also created an env file. Let me just close the sidebar so you can see what's going on. And here's the beautiful part about Prisma. So this connection string here, you can replace this with anything later. You can create a database on Supabase for free, right? You can just drop in the connection string here and you don't have to change anything else. Prisma supports many databases from PostgreSQL, SQL to even MongoDB, I think. But before we get to writing our schema, we also need to install the Prisma client, which is going to let us interface with the database. So I'm going to say pnpm I, we can say Prisma client, and I'll give it a second. Awesome, so now let's create our schema. So I'm going to close the terminal. Let's close this, and now we can start creating our model here. And model just means table. Model post, and I'm going to give it an ID. And also if you want this auto completion, you can get the Prisma extension from VS Code, but you don't have to. So we can just say int, which is a built-in type. ID is also built in, and also you can see how we get this great auto completion thanks to TypeScript. We can just say auto increment, and of course I didn't make this up, I just took this from the Prisma example, which also had this created at timestamp, which is a built-in date type time. We can say default now, so that's how simple that is. You also might want to know when it's updated. Again, we can use the same thing, but here is a special updated at, and now we can create our own fields. So we can go here, and basically this is really intuitive. You're like, okay, title is text. What is text in Prisma? It's string, of course. And now we can just say content or body string, and if we give it a question mark, it's optional because you might want to create an empty post, which is fine. For the slug, we want to be it unique, so you can just say string, and we can also make it unique using this. So we can look this up using Prisma, which is going to be really simple. And then we can also have a publish field, so this is going to be a boolean, simple as that. And we also can give it a default value, which is really awesome. So you can just say false, and now we don't really need to even think about this field. And now when I'm going to save, Prisma is going to format this file. But before we create the database, let's create a seed file. So we're not going to need this schema anymore. We can close this. Let's go to Prisma. I'm going to say new file, seed ts. You can say import Prisma client. This should autocomplete for us. Very nice. We can say const db new Prisma client. And now we're going to create a type post, which is going to be matching the post from the dummy JSON response. So you can just say title string, body string, and we can open it here on the side so you can see. Here we open it, which is awesome. So as you can see, here it returns an object with a post array. And this has for every post ID, title, body. We don't really care about ID. We're going to create this ourselves. And these are things we don't care about. And that's why I only created this type for title and body. So you get great auto completion. All right, so now let's fetch this post. So we're basically, let's copy this URL because we're going to need it. We can say async function get post. And now I can say const response await fetch. And now I can just copy over this URL. And now we can destructure post because this is what it returns on the object, right? Const post from await response JSON. And now we're going to return the post. And if I save this, you can see one problem here. It returns promise any, so we don't really get the type back. And that's why we created this type. So in TypeScript, we can say as post, but this is just a single post. So we have to say, hey, this is an array of posts. Awesome. And now if you hover over this, you can see it returns a promise, which is of type post as an array. So that's really not complicated. And I'm also going to create another function that's going to be slugify. So as you can see here, this is this long title, and I want to create slugs from our post title, which would be really convenient if the API had this, but it doesn't, so we have to do it ourselves. You don't really need to import any other library because it's really simple to create such a function. So you can say function slugify. It's going to take in some text, which is going to be a string, and it's going to return that text. Let me just make this easier to read. So we can just say text, replace, and now we can give it some regex, and then we can also define what it needs to replace. So you do it like this, and you say global, so it's going to take into account everything, and now we need to target whitespace, so we can say this. So this is going to target every whitespace, and now what do we want to replace it with? We can replace it with banana or whatever, but let's just say we want a dash. And next we want to remove any characters that are not letters, numbers, and etc. So this can be punctuation, some special symbols or whatever. And you can chain this, so you can say replace. And now we can also specify a regex. And let's just say we want to replace it with nothing. So let's start writing the regex here. We can do this matching thing. So we're going to match A lowercase to Z, A uppercase to uppercase Z. And then we also want to match any number. But of course, this really isn't what we want. We want the opposite of this. We want to match anything that isn't this. So how do you do that? You can specify it using a caret symbol. You can do this. And now this means, hey, I'm going to match anything that isn't here. And also for the last part, we're going to say to lowercase, because we want the slug in lowercase. And let me just show you how this works. So I can get this part, and I'm going to go here. I'm just going to open the developer tools. And let me just clear this. And this is complaining because we don't really have the development server. So actually, this is really annoying. Let's just go here and let's go to the console. And now I'm going to copy over this code. So of course, let's give it some text. So you can say, it's a me, Mario. And now this should create a slug. So you can see it should replace this and it should fill in the dashes here. So if I press enter, and good thing that we done it because we made a mistake. And this is why regex is so tricky. So you can see here, we need to preserve the dash, right? So we also need to say dash here, and this should work. So we can see it's a me, Mario. Okay, so let me just also give you another tip. If you go to regexer, you can actually learn how this thing works. So if I take in this regex, let me just paste this in, and let's also just give it an example. It's a me, Mario. And you can see it's going to not only match it what you want, right? So you know it works, but it's also going to give you a description. So this is really a negated set, and this is going to give you all the description here. And maybe you can also ask ChatGPT, which would be really interesting, right? But yeah, really that's a hot tip. So we can just close this for now. And let me just clear this. I'm just going to close this. So basically now we have the slugify, and now we're going to loop over the posts and add them to the database. So I'm going to create a function, async function main. You can name this whatever you want because we're just going to run it. So before we forget, let's just invoke it. So when the script runs, it's going to run. So now we can get the post. We can say const post await get post, and we can see we're also going to get the types here, which is really awesome. So let me just briefly show you how simple it is to add a post in Prisma. So what we can do is we can say await db post. We can say create. You can see how awesome this auto-completion is. You don't really have to think about it or look at the documentation. And now when we pass it here, this is why TypeScript is so awesome, because we can just say control spacebar, and then we have our option. We can say, okay, select doesn't make sense here, I have only data, so I can do that. You can see here is an object. And now we can also go deeper, and I can press Control Spacebar again, and you can see here is the awesome auto completion for Prisma. So you can see everything you can enter here. But basically what we have to add is the title, which is going to come from the post title. And don't worry, this is going to come from our loop. Just want to focus on this. So we can say content post body, and remember we have to use our slugify to create a slug. So we can just say slugify post title, and now we can create the loop. And when I'm dealing with async things like this that I need to loop over, I honestly don't like using map because the code looks really ugly, because you have to wrap it in promise all or whatever, and it looks really ugly. And for this reason, I prefer something that's more readable, and that's a for off loop. So you can just say for const post of post, and now we can just do this, and now we can move the code here. Just like that. And now we can see here we have auto completion from post, and you can even destructure this if you want. Since we have types, you can see body title if you want to do that, but I honestly prefer legibility when someone else is reading this code. And basically that's everything. It's not that bad, right? So you can just save it. And now before we can run the C script, we need to add a C script, right? So we can just go to package.json, I press Control P, and now we're just going to create a Prisma script. And again, this isn't some magic knowledge, this is just from reading the Prisma documentation. They have a nice section, but one thing that isn't nice is how they describe seeding, which isn't going to work in SvelteKit because we're using type module, which is using native JavaScript module, and this is going to work with TS Node. But here is a simple solution to that. So you can just say Prisma, following just like they have it in the documentation. Now we need a seed script, and here is the part that's just going to work like a magic. So instead of using TS Node, how they recommend it, we're just going to say pnpx. We're going to use the vnode package, which is going to transpile on the fly the TypeScript file. So we can just say Prisma. We need to point it to the seed script, seed ts, and this is just going to work. Now we can run the migrate command, which is going to create the database from the Prisma schema and run the seed script if it finds it. So now we can open the terminal, and I'm going to press Ctrl L to clear everything. And now we can run pnpx Prisma migrate. So it's dev name, and now we can give it any name you want. This can be banana, but I'm just going to stick to init as they show in their example. So this is going to create the database from the schema, and it's going to run the seed script. So let's press enter, and it should take a second. Awesome. So let's close the terminal so I can show you what happened, and also close the seed file. You won't ever have to look at it again. So here it created the SQLite database for us, which is really awesome. And you can see here it created a migrations folder. So every time you make a change to your database, you're going to have a migration here. So here is an init, and here is the magic sauce. So it creates the raw SQL code for you. This is how Prisma works, and it's really awesome. So let me just close this. And another way how you can confirm that everything works, Prisma has a graphical user interface which you can use to check out your database, which is called Prisma Studio, and it really gives me PHPMyAdmin vibes, which is really awesome. So you can just say pnpx Prisma Studio, and it's going to open it in your browser. And here are the posts, but what you're going to most likely see if you open it for the first time, you're going to see this view. Here are going to be older tables. So you can see here we have posts. And now when you view posts, here is the timestamps, updated at title, we have the content, and now we also have the slug. Oh, but of course I made a blunder, and I'm really glad this happened so I can show you how you can reset your database. So remember how we corrected the mistake, not package.json, in our C script. I really forgot to enter the dash here, right? So literally small mistake, but I'm going to leave this in because it's going to be awesome. So let me just save this. So what you can do, of course, is you can delete everything, but you can also say here, pnpx Prisma, you can say migrate reset. Are you sure you want to delete this? You can just say yes. Now we can delete the migration, and now I can press Ctrl L to clear everything. And let's just do the migration again. So you can say pnpx Prisma migrate. So it was dev name init. Let's do this again. Awesome. So let's run pnpx Prisma Studio, which would open it in another tab. So let's just close this, and let's see if this works this time. And awesome. Now we have our slugs. One last thing we have to do is actually export the database for use in our SvelteKit application. So for now, I'm just going to close Prisma Studio. I'm going to close this API, and let me just close this, close the seed file. I'm going to collapse everything just so we know where we are, right? So we can go to source, and here is a special folder we can create, which is aliased in SvelteKit. We can just say lib, and now we can create a database TS file. And inside our database file, we're just going to do the same thing we did in the C script. We can say Prisma client from Prisma client. And now we can create the database again, new Prisma client, and let's just default export it. Awesome, now you can use this anywhere in our app. Let's talk about API endpoints. You probably used an API like dummy JSON. So for example, if I go here and look at all the available endpoints, I can see here is the products, cards, users, and posts endpoint I'm interested in. And let's go to the post. And what really happens here, right? So to understand this, we need to open the developer tools. So we can say Control-Shift-I, and let's go to the network tab. Also make sure you disable cache. And now when we reload the page, you're going to see some junk, which is not important, but here is the important part, what is actually returned. Here is the document post. So we can see here are the headers, preview, which is the JSON that got back. So here are all the posts. So this is basically what we can fetch and show or do whatever. Here is the raw response. So if you go to the header, here's the request URL, the request method, which is get the status code 200 OK. But how does it know, right, that this is like JSON and it should show it like this? Basically, this is because of the response header. So we can see the content type on the response header is set to application JSON. And also another thing is that you might not be seeing this like this. And the reason is because I'm using an extension. So if I go to extensions, and this is true for all Chromium-based browsers, which is really surprising to me that the current year Chrome doesn't have this and Firefox had this for years. So we can go to extensions. You can get an extension like JSON viewer. So this is how it would look like for you if you don't have any extension. Let me just go here. I'm going to refresh the page. So you can see now that this matches the exact same raw response, but basically we can just get an extension, use JSON viewer if you want, but you can use anything else. I'm just going to refresh it. And I'm also, if you're curious, you can go to the settings here, and I'm using this Panda syntax theme. So I can close this, and this looks great. All right, but where am I going with this? Basically, what I'm trying to say is that SvelteKit also makes creating API endpoints simple. And you do that by creating a special plus.serverts file that exports a function that corresponds to a HTTP verb, which is get, post, patch, put, delete, or whatever else. That function takes a request and returns a response. And if you don't know about HTTP request methods, where do you learn about it? Of course, on MDN. So you can say HTTP request methods. You can go here. You can open MDN, and now you can see the explanation for this. You can see each one, and this is how you learn. And this is a great thing about SvelteKit because we're going to spend more time learning about web standards on MDN than actually reading the SvelteKit documentation. Alright, so let's create an endpoint. So to show this how this works, basically what I'm going to create, if I close this, so remember we have our here development server which should be running, and now I basically want to create this endpoint. I want API newsletter. And right now it's not found, but let's see how we can create it. So I'm going to open the sidebar, and in source routes, I'm going to create a special folder API/newsletter. This isn't convention. You can name it banana or whatever you want. In some frameworks, this is convention that you have to have an API folder, but I just use it to know where this type of files are if this is some API that's used across the app. So here in routes, I can say new file, so you can start creating some folders. I can say API newsletter, and then we have to create this special plus server ts file. And now we can close the sidebar. And now we can create the functions that match the HTTP request methods. So we're going to create one that's API newsletter. This is going to be the get request. And also we're going to create a one that's going to be newsletter post request. And how do we create it? Well, we just say export const, what we want, get, right? And we're also going to use our request handler type. If you press enter, it should auto import it. Or we can do this. And now we can say async, but you don't really have to. And here is an event which comes by default. So we're going to talk about this in a second. So we're going to do this, and let's just return some text, right? So remember how we said that it returns a response, and we actually looked at the response in the network tools. So you can say return new response, and you can just return anything. And also see this awesome type completion. You can see body and the options. We can just say hello. And now if I save this, it should return hello. And if we look at the network tab, you can go here, just refresh. Here is the newsletter. And this looks familiar, right? So we can see request method, status code, content type text. So basically we can infer that the browser does this by default if you don't supply anything, so you don't have to specify it yourself, and the browser is actually smart enough to understand the content type in most cases. And I also want to talk about the response objects. You might be thinking about this, if you're seeing this for the first time, okay, I can probably learn about it in the SvelteKit doc. Wrong. You're going to hear me talk about all this time about using web standards, and response is a web standard. So you can go MDN response, you can open MDN, you can see here the description, and now we can go to the constructor, right? So here's what we're using actually, right? New response, you can see, okay, here is the body options, but of course, if you're using TypeScript, you already know about this because you get awesome auto-completion. But you can actually learn more about it here. You can see what you can pass in. So you can pass a blob, array buffer. I never use these things, to be honest. I use blobs. Array buffer, no idea what this is, etc. Yeah, readable streams, this is something cool, right? But yeah, this is really awesome, and you can learn so much. Not just about SvelteKit, but the web in general, which is transferable knowledge. Alright, but let's look at MDN as these options, and let's create the options ourselves. So you can just create them here, like this, that would be fine. I just want to create a separate one so it's more readable. So I can say const options, and this is of type response init, which should be available globally. This really isn't important. I just want this to have auto-completion. So if I press Control Spacebar, I'm going to see, header status and status text, and how awesome it is. So let's create our own status, right? We can say 418, which is going to return the teapot status, which is a hilarious meme in web development. And then let's also specify some headers so we can take the meme to the next level. And now we can give this whatever name you want, like, right? This is like the part about learning and playing around. Like all of this looks serious, like, like your life depends on it, right? But you can just play around and have fun. So I can just name it X, and what does X do? Of course, X is gonna give it to you. Now we can pass the options here. Let's just save it. And now when we refresh the page, you should see here, here is our status code. And what is that status code? You can see 4800, I'm a teapot. You can learn more about this on MDN, the origin of this joke. And we can see something interesting here. So here is our own header, X, and what does X do? X is gonna give it to you. Alright, so this is awesome, but let's say for example you want to subscribe someone to your newsletter, or you're using some other API. So we can create a post request, and let me just close this. And now here, we can just go to our post. So basically we can use a form, we can use the method type post, and this is going to ping this instead, right? Because when we visit this page, it's going to trigger the get, but we want to trigger the post, which we can do using a fetch request, which I'm going to show you in a second. But yeah, let's just do that. So how do we do that? Export const post, and we can say request handler, which would be the same type. And let's just say event. I'm just including this so you know that this is what you get by default, even if we use it or not. But in this case, we're going to use it because we can get something interesting from the event, which is the request. So let me just show you that. So we can just say, it's going to be the data from the form, right? Because we're going to submit it. So you can just say data, await, event, and what is on the request? TypeScript, help us out. So you can see here are some interesting things which we're going to talk about later. So we can just say event request to get the access to the request. And what is on the request? Form data. Beautiful. So now we can get the data, and now we can get the email from the data. So let me just move this up. So how do we get this? And basically this is also something you can look up on MDN, the form data and how you work with it. And you're going to find out that you get a value from form data by using the get method. So you can say get, and you're going to have a field which has a name email, right? And then here is some logic, so you can subscribe the user to the newsletter, but here we're just going to console log out the email when we submit it. Alright, so now here's the interesting thing. So remember how we had new response. So basically we want to return JSON, and I'm just going to create a new line so this is more readable. So basically we need to stringify first whatever we get. So we have to say JSON stringify, or some experts would say we need to serialize it. Okay, so to do that. And now we're also going to return a success true. So basically when we get this response, we can show a success message to the user, right? So we're going to return a success true, because this isn't going to get returned if this fails, right? This is just going to explode. Okay, so now for the headers, this is important. We can say headers. Let's do it like this. Actually, I'm going to rename it. And now you set headers like this. And again, you'll learn about this also on MDN. How do you set headers? So you can say content type. This is the same thing we've seen in the network tab. And what do we want? Application JSON. And we also need to match it because this is another one. We need to do it like this. And when I save it, it's going to format it anyhow. So that all goes through the window, which is really awesome. So yeah, we can do it like this. And now we just need to use it. So how can we do this? Let me just go to the sidebar. And here in our routes, I'm just going to open the default page. So now let's pretend that we're trying to make a sign up, right? So we can say H1 newsletter. We're going to have a form. We don't have to specify an action. This is by default get, actually not an action, this is the URL. The method we're going to have to specify, which is default get, but we're going to specify post. But actually we're going to use JavaScript here, so we don't really need this, but you can also get this from the form even if you use JavaScript. But let's keep it simple. I'm just going to remove this. I'm going to have on submit, and I'm just going to use this handy thing from SvelteKit, prevent default. And now we're just going to create a function subscribe. So here instead of submit, you say subscribe, and default is going to be submit, so we don't really need this. And let me just go here, and now we just need an input that's going to be of type email. You can just say, yeah, type email. We can just give it a name, and this is really important. This is how we get the value from this thing. So we can just say email, and you can even remove this. Of course, introduce some semantic markup in your HTML. And let's just create a script tag. And now here is the more tedious part, because we actually have to do this tedious part where we have to fetch to the endpoint and etc. And that's why SvelteKit has another more awesome way of working with forms, which I'm going to save for another part. But for now, we're going to do this. I'm going to say async function subscribe, and it's going to return an event, which is of type event. So now we can get the form itself. Remember, we can say event target, or you can use this, but I really prefer this. And now to appease TypeScript, we just need to say, hey, this is a HTML form element, so treat it as a form element. And now we need to get the data. And remember, this is what we get here, right? When we pass it back. Okay, so how do we do that? We say const data new form data. Ah, that's interesting, right? So this is something also you can look up on MDN. And we pass it back the form, and now this is going to return the form values, right? Which we can use. And remember, now we need to ping our endpoint. How do we do that? Well, we use fetch. Await fetch. What do we want to ping? API newsletter. And now we need to give it options, right? So here is an options object. And now we can say method post. Ah, how awesome is that? And now for the body, we return the data. All right, so let me just save this. And again, now we're going to return this data from the form, whatever we passed in. And you can also have values here that you can bind if you want. This is honestly way simpler and closer to the web. So this is what you're going to get here from the form data. Remember, we created this form data here. How awesome is this? And now we have our own endpoint because we have an actual server. And we don't really need an entire server. We can use serverless functions from Excel, which is actually perfectly suited for this, because you can spin up one action at a time than having to have some server constantly running in the background. So now we can get the email, and this is going to log out the email. And you're going to see in response, if it's successful, you're going to see a success message. All right, so let me go to localhost 5173. Here is our form. I'm just going to move it here. And now we should see this logged out on the server if I open the terminal here. So let's just give it an email here, say that I want to subscribe. And actually, let me just open the network tab here. So I'm just going to press subscribe, and you see, here's the email, right? Okay. And now you can see here is the fetch request. How awesome it is. So now when we go here, we can see it made a post request to API newsletter. And now we can see the payload, the preview. It returns the success, and you can return whatever you want. And now, since you've done the fetch here, you can go even further. You can take this from the response, and then you can update some state inside your app if this returned whatever you want, right? And then you can show whatever you want to the user. And how awesome is this? And you can use this in many different ways. So for example, if I go to even my site, you can see, for example, that all of these posts have view counters. And basically that's done by having an API that just pings Supabase, so it just increments the count in some database whenever someone visits a page. And this is how you can use an API endpoint whenever you need to hit some endpoint or whatever, an API endpoint is really useful. And again, I want to repeat that in SvelteKit, which is going to be on another part, we're going to explore a much better way with working with forms in SvelteKit. Alright, so this was just an introduction to API endpoints, but what I really want to make, I want to make an API post endpoint. So you can go to API post, and this should return all the posts from our database, so we can use it across our app. And this is what I'm going to do next. So let me just close this, and let me just keep this open. Let's close the terminal. So now I'm going to close this, and we can close this. So now we're going to create another route. So I'm going to go to API, and I'm going to say new file, and this time I'm going to create a post folder, and I'm going to say plus server ts. And now we're going to use Prisma to fetch the posts from our database and return them as JSON so we can use them. It's going to be exactly the same as the dummy JSON API. And later we're going to even enhance it so I can show you how you can make your own API more interesting and special. Alright, so let's close this. And now if you use the SvelteKit extension, you can just use kit, and you can just say kit endpoint. This is going to give you a much quicker snippet, so you don't have to type all of this out. So we can say export const get, and again, we can just import this request handler. They should import it here. And let me just, instead of returning this, I'm going to show you something. So we can go here, and now we just need to use Prisma to get the post. And how do we do that? Well, first we're going to import our database. Remember we created this, db from, and this is aliased automatically for you, lib database. See, it already knows, and this is by default in SvelteKit. And you can also alias other folders if you want. Okay, so how do we get the post? And this couldn't be simpler. So we just say const post, and now we need to use Prisma. So we can say await db post find many, and that's it. This is going to return all the posts. And now remember how we said that we need to return, so we can say return new response, and remember how we had to stringify and etc. to return a JSON response? Well, this is so common in fact that SvelteKit has a helper function for you, so you don't have to do this. So you can say return JSON. If you press enter, it should auto import this from SvelteKit. So I can place this at the top. So now you can say return JSON. Now you don't need to do any of that. Now you can just return the post. I can save it, and now this should work. So now let's go here. We're going to refresh this, and now we should get the post. Awesome. And it's the almost same exact thing like you get from dummy JSON. And here is our database. So remember we had a created at, updated title. Now we get the slug also we get the published, etc. if that's what you want. And here are all the posts that we had in our database. And now we can go here to posts. We can see again, same like that other API, right? We have a request method status code. Here is of type JSON. We can go to the preview, exact same thing. Here is the raw response, right? And how awesome is this? So while I'm here, I want to explain the event object to you because it's very important. And you're going to see this across your entire SvelteKit app when it comes to loading data and etc. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to use an event here, and then I'm going to console log it out. So I'm just going to say console log event. And if you're using TypeScript, of course, you can destructure it here, and you already see all the options here, cookies, fetch, and etc. But let's just do this. I'm just going to open the terminal. Let's save everything. And now when we reload the page, we're going to see, oh, here is some interesting things here. So you can see, so this is a method to get and set cookies in SvelteKit. Then you also have fetch, which has superpowers, which we're going to see how it works in a second. So this is going to give you extra features like inheriting cookies and authorization headers for the page request. It can do relative and internal requests on the server. And it's also going to prevent additional requests because it inlines the response from the HTML, which really doesn't mean anything, but we're going to see how that works in a second. We also, of course, have params of the current page. So remember, previously when we had slug or whatever, it is going to give you those params. We already seen how the request works, so it's going to give you the original request object. The route has the information about the route. So if you go here is the request. There's a lot. Here's the route API post. Here's the URL, so you can get whatever you want from here. Same as you can from that store that we used previously, if you remember from the last part. And then you also have another interesting thing, which is a way to set headers. So this also returns set headers, which is right here. So you can set the headers for the endpoint or for the page. So let me actually show you an example of that. And this is going to be really cool. So we can go here, and again, we're in our post endpoint. And now remember how we said that this should find many. I'm just going to remove this. Here I also want to get a random number of posts each time so we can see that caching works. So we can specify to Prisma take, and now we just need to generate a random number between 0 and 30. So we can say math round because it's going to return a float or whatever. So we can just say math random, and now we need to multiply it by the number of posts. So this should always be random, and we're going to fetch this post, and I'm going to show you how this works. And now here is how simple it is to set your own headers. So from the event, we have set headers, and now you can specify your headers. Again, cache, control, and you also learn how to do this on MDN. So you can say max age is going to be 60 seconds. So this is going to be fresh for 60 seconds, and whenever you make a request to this, it's going to cache it to your disk and show it to the user. So you can go to MDN, HTTP caching, and it should open the HTTP caching link so you can learn everything you need to know about caching, of course. Alright, but before I show you that, let's first talk about how we can actually show the data on the page. Alright, so let's see how we can show the data on the page, and this might look familiar to you because we're going to use client-side rendering, and this is how you've done it in the past in React, Vue, and Svelte before SvelteKit. First I'm going to remove all of this code because this is just an example, so we can just save it, and then I'm going to add a script like this, and now I'm going to create a function to get the post. So now we can say const response. I can say await fetch, and remember here is our API post. So if I go here and just copy this over, if we go to API post, it's really just like any other API. We can ping this and we can return some data, nothing special here. So we can just go here, we can say const post, and thankfully Prisma generates the type for us, so we can get the post like this. We can specify this is an array of posts, and then we can say await response JSON. And let me just clear it like here, and I'm just going to return posts. So now that we have this promise, we can use a special await block from Svelte to get the data and show it to the user. So I'm going to go here, I'm going to say h1 post. So if we save this, we can see here are the posts. And now we can start using the block. We can say await. We have to use the promise get posts. And now here you can set the loading data. This is only going to show for a brief second because it's really fast. And now when you have the data, you can say then. You can name this whatever you want. I'm just going to name it post. And I'm also going to use my snippet that I used previously, just so we can see what's on the page. And now in case you have an error, you can say catch error. Like this. And now we also need to close the await block. You can do it like this. And now we need to say P. You can output the error message in case you have an error. Okay, let's save this, and you already seen this took a millisecond. And now, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. So you can see we got a random amount of posts, even though there's 30 posts. And remember, this is because previously we used take, and now we use math random. So now remember, because we set the cache control header, this is going to be fresh for a minute. So no matter how much you refresh, you should see 25 posts. So here you can see here is 25 posts. And the way you can break this spell, if you go to the network tab, since we disable cache, if I refresh this right now, this should refresh with a completely random set amount of posts. Let me just go here. So here you can see it returned 21. If I refresh it again, it returned 11. And of course, you shouldn't rely this in production. You should use smaxh so you get it cached on the CDN. So for example, if I go here to post, let me just see maxh 60. So you can see here it's cached, and it's also going to say that it's read from the disk. Of course, let me just enable it like this so we can see the request. And you can see here it says disk cache. So now when you open it, you can see 200 OK from disk cache. And when you're using a CDN in your headers, you're going to have a header here that's going to say hit for the cache. And you would set maxh to 0. Of course, if you're generating a completely static site generated site, you really don't have to think about this. When you upload it to something to Vercel, they're going to set the cache to forever until the next time you redeploy or whatever. So basically, you would set something if you're using server-side rendering. You would set this to public. You would set maxh to 0. And then you have x maxh 60. So for example, if you have a deluge of traffic, You're not going to hammer the servers, it's going to get cached by the first person. It might take the initial response more time, but the subsequent responses are going to be much quicker. So this is how you set the cache control header if you're using server-side rendering and want to cache something on a CDN. But yeah, I can just revert it to what I had before, just as an example, and that's basically it. And also let's actually display the post. So I'm going to close this and let's go here. Whoops. I'm just going to remove this and we can just use good old Svelte to loop over the data. And you can also see the caching in play if we, let's see, do I get auto-completion? Awesome. We can just say showing, so we can get the post length. So showing amount of posts. And then let's just loop over the data. Let me just create space here so it's easier to read. We can say each post as post. And now we can close the each here. And now we can just display. So we can say ul li. I'm just going to show a link. So you can just say slash post. This is what you're going to use in the future. And now we can say post slug, because remember, this is why we created a slug. So we have here to visit the post, and we can just say post title. And of course, if you want to be clever, you can destructure it here. Since we have type completion, you can see all of the things that are available to you. So you can say post title and etc. like this, slug title. And now we can even remove this. And now when I save this, showing 25 posts, and this should be cached, showing 25 posts. But remember, we can always break the magic spell. If we go here, disable caching, and now it should always return different data. How awesome is this? Alright friends, so we've seen how we can show data on the page using client-side rendering. But this comes with some problems. For example, here we have posts and we really want great SEO. And now when Google visits us, or the GOAT Bing, it's going to have problems parsing this JavaScript. Of course, search engines can parse JavaScript in theory, but that takes compute, and really is Google going to waste resources on you? So really don't believe those fairy tales when people tell you that it's fine to just use JavaScript. It's not, for many reasons, because if you want great SEO, you have to use server-side rendering. So let me show you what this means. If you go to view page source, here you're going to see loading. Let me see if I can zoom in. Yeah, so this is the only markup you're going to see. And why is that? Well, because we're using client-side rendering. And if we go to the network tab, I'm just going to refresh this. And let me just go to the document here. And this is the only thing that returns. So this really isn't server-side rendered. So basically you're just getting an empty shell HTML file. And whatever has to load here after the fact, it uses JavaScript or Svelte in this case, which is why when a search engine comes here, unless you can execute a JavaScript on your page, and this is why you won't get great SEO, because this is what the search engine is going to see unless it's able to execute JavaScript on your page. Downfall of this is that the JavaScript has to load first before it can even start fetching the data, so it does a round trip, right? If you're making a dashboard or whatever, like who cares, right? But for example, something like post here or etc. where you want great SEO, server-side rendering is a must almost. Using server-side rendering is just a much nicer user experience and is going to avoid loading spinners everywhere. So instead of using client-side rendering, I want to take advantage of server-side rendering in SvelteKit and fetch the data before the page loaded, which is going to result in a faster and more resilient app. Alright, so how can we do this? Let me just close the developer tools and also going to close this view source. So how we do this in SvelteKit, a page plus Svelte can have a sibling plus page TS file that exports a load function which returns data for the page and nothing else. So let's create that file. I'm going to open the sidebar, and here in source, routes, so remember here is the page Svelte at the root of routes. You can create new file plus page TS, and now we need to export a load function. So we can say export const load. The type is going to be page load, and it should auto import it for us, which is nice. We can just say async. It also takes an event, right? So you're going to see this everywhere when it comes to data loading. And now we need to do something special. We need to use a fetch method from SvelteKit so it understands the relative paths on the server. We talked about this before, if you remember. So you can say const response await fetch, and now we can just point it to our API. So you can say API post, and now we're going to get the response. I'm going to use the post from Prisma, which is going to auto import for us, which is nice. Now we can say await response JSON, And now we just return the data. So you have to say return an object, and now we can return the posts. The posts are going to now become available to our page inside a data param. So we can see if we go here, I'm just going to remove everything here. And now we're going to start by creating a script again. And I'm just going to say export let data. And this is already typed for us, which is really awesome because SvelteKit here generated the types, posts here, and now we can use those. So now we can go here and we can say page data. And this is the only thing you have to import here. So now if we save this and let me just hover over this, you can see this is already typed, which is really awesome. All right, so now we just need to use this data. So we can just say post. And again, we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to say showing post length. It's data post length, my bad. Data post length. Posts. Okay, sweet. So now we can loop over it. Again, I can say each data post, right? As post. And now we can close it here. And now let's just say ul li. Again, we're going to use the link post. So we want the slug, if you remember, post slug. And here we're going to use the post title. All right, so let's save this and we should see our data, which should be server side rendered. Awesome. And again, we can just refresh it. We're just going to get a random amount of posts. So now when we go to the network tab, and let me just refresh this, you can see we actually get the entire document. So here you see 11 posts. Here you see the same thing. So now when Google or the legend Bing comes around, he's going to say, oh, here are some posts. Okay, I better index this. And boom, bam, thank you, ma'am. Now you're #1 ranked on Google or whatever. Congrats. And also another thing I want you to note is that you can't find a single fetch request here. So if you try, you couldn't, because why? It happens on the server, right? And you would only see a fetch request if you navigate to some other link, because SvelteKit at that point, as you learned in another part, becomes almost like a single page application. Because when you first visit the page, there shouldn't be any links, right? So let's see if we go to posts. So even if it says not found, now if we go and preload home, you should see here is the fetch request, because this is basically client-side rendering. But if you go to home and your first time visiting the page is going to render on the server, and that's why there is no fetch request here. And also another thing I want to show you, how I mentioned, and this is one that gets me all the time. I use rarely fetch like this here because I'm using a database or whatever, but because of that, because you don't use it all the time, you're going to get into this issue. You're going to forget about this fetch because fetch works on the server because it's fully filled. So you're going to have an event and this all looks great, right? You're like, okay, great, this is going to work great. And now you save this and you get an internal error, which is honestly not that helpful. And now you're going to waste half an hour here trying to understand this. Cannot use relative URL. If you know about what I talked about, this should make sense. But if you don't, then you're like, okay, what does this even mean? Like, why does this work? And you're just going to get confused. So remember, this is why this fetch is useful, because it comes with superpowers. So this is just going to work. Also remember how I also mentioned that fetch inlines the data, and what does that really mean? So for example, if we go to the page source here, you can see here is your actual HTML. But look at this. Here is the data itself. So SvelteKit isn't going to have to do the same work again, because it's just going to inline this data, and if nothing has changed, it's just going to show the data. So let me just close this. And another tip I want to show you when you go to page.svelte. So this is great data post, but honestly, you're going to have a lot of things and it's going to become a pain having to constantly use data dot whatever. But we can use reactive declarations and we can destructure posts. So for example, let's say you do const, I'm going to say post from data. So this is fine, but this really wouldn't be reactive, because when you update this, nothing is going to happen. So the next step you can do is use a reactive declaration, which is a $sign. But there's another problem. This isn't valid syntax. So you can just group it like this. And now if you save it, everything should work. And this is now reactive. When something changes, it's going to update data. So now we can go here and I'm going to say Control D. So everywhere where we use this, I'm just going to remove it. And let's also be a hotshot. We can say slug title. Can remove it here. Save it. And let me just close this. And everything should work great. This is great, but sometimes you only want to run code on the server. The plus page.ts file is great for fetching data for the page, but also you have to keep in mind that it runs on the server and browser, and it won't work if you need to use some secrets or want to use the file system or database. I'm going to show you this by creating a slug route that should get the post from the database using the slug parameter. So I'm going to open the sidebar, and inside our routes, I'm going to create a new folder. So I'm going to say posts. I'm going to create another folder, slug, and I'm going to create page.svelte, and let's just give it a title. This should be post. So now when we get the post here and go, we should just see post, and you can see it's going to update. So this should always show the same, but we want to dynamically show posts, and this is also why we created the slugs, which is really awesome. So now what we have to do is fetch the data on the page like we've done before. So here in posts, we can go to slug, and remember, we can create a page.ts file, and we're going to see why this won't work in a minute. But first, let's just create the code. So we can export a load function. We can say export const load page load. Let's import it. And now we can say async. We're going to need params from the event, because we're going to take the slug and we're going to fetch it from the database. So now we can get the post. We can say const post await. If we start typing db and press enter, it should also auto import. And this is why TypeScript is really awesome, because it's really smart about these things in your editor. So we can say db post find unique. Remember, because we specified that the slug should be unique, so this is really easy. Find unique. And now if we get auto completion, what are the options? Where, right? And now we can just give it a slug. It also knows this, slug, the unique identifier. How do we get the slug? From the param slug. If you go here, for example, and you do console params, you should see the slug bag, which we already learned in the previous part. So now let's do some error handling. So for example, if there is no post, we're going to throw an expected error. If you also remember that from a previous part, we're going to say throw error. So this is going to be expected. Let's auto import error from SvelteKit. So we can say throw error. Let's give it a 404, and we can say post not found. And now we can return the post if everything is all right. And basically that should be it. So now if you look at the terminal, remember how we console log this out here. Let me just refresh it so you can see this is the slug. So this is how we can fetch data, as we've seen in the previous part when I teased this. And now we're going to see why this doesn't work. You already see we have an internal error. So if you go here to our console, you can see error, Prisma client is unable to be run in the browser. Okay, so how do we solve this? Like, is this all code for nothing? We're going to throw this away? Nope. It's really simple as renaming plus page.ts to plus page.server.ts. So it's only going to be run on the server. So if I go here, I'm going to close this. So inside your sidebar, inside the slug folder, we're going to rename page.ts.server.ts. And now, if we go here, we need to change some things. Instead of page load, this becomes page server load. So we can remove this type here. Let me just save this, and I'm going to refresh, and everything should work. When you're accessing secret environment variables, talking to a file system or a database, you have to use .server, but by default, just use plus page ts for everything else. Alright, so let's dynamically render the post and show it to the user. So we can go to page svelte where we have the slug. So now we can actually get the data, right? So let me just remove this. Let's add a script. And now we can say export let data. Nothing changes here. You're receiving the data. We can auto import page data like this. And I'm also going to create a helper function that's going to format the date, because we also return it from the database. I'm going to say format date. It's going to accept the date is going to be of type date. And we're going to return this useful JavaScript feature. We're going to say Intel date time format, which is a really nice way how we can format dates. We can say English, and for the date style, we can use long. And then we also have to say format, and we need to pass it the date, and that's going to be great. So now we can show it in our template. So I'm going to create a heading group. I'm going to say h1, and I'm not going to use the fancy destructuring because I really want to focus on this concept. So I can say data post title. As you can see, we already have great auto-completion from TypeScript, which is really awesome. And if you're not using TypeScript, of course, you can use JSDoc. So you would just copy paste the JSDoc comment here, you will get the same awesome type completion. So this is going to be the title, and I'm going to add a subtitle. And here's going to be the date. So let's just do date post created at. Now if we save, we should see this, and this really doesn't look pretty, right? But we can already see our post is working. And I'm also going to have some content here. And if we had some HTML or whatever in our post, which we usually do, right? Even when it's markdown, we can just use HTML from Svelte. We can say data post content, and this should show it for this page. All right, so now when you go to home, his mother has always taught him, you can see this is going to work, the other post is going to work, and all the other posts are going to work. And now you're dynamically rendering data. But let's also format the date. So here we can use our utility function. You can save this in a utility folder or whatever. So let's just see how this is useful. Really simple to format date this way. You can see January 10th. And you also have other short, I think. You can use auto-completion. This is, again, why TypeScript is so awesome. You don't need to open the docs. Just see all the available options to you. January 10, it's a full. This is going to give you the full. But yeah, we're using long, so we can just keep it at that. So not a lot has changed beside the file name and the types for the load function becoming page server load instead of page server. In general, whenever you need to create an API or make a HTTP request, use +server.ts, and when you only care about data for the page, use +page.ts or +page.server.ts. In this section, we're also going to talk about how your layout files can also load data. Your +layout.svelte files can also load data using a +layout.ts or +layout.server.ts file, the same as your +page.svelte files. And you might be wondering, why would you do that? Well, the superpower of doing that is that the data returned from layout load function is not only available to that layout, but it's also available to all the child routes, meaning you can pass data like a hot potato through your routes. Let me just quickly show you how that looks like. So here in source routes, you can see how we have the root layout here. So if you want to load the data, we can just create a new file, layout.ts here. And now if you have the SvelteKit extension, you can just do this, but instead of page load, the type is layout load. So this is going to get imported from you. You also get the event the same as before. And now we're just going to return a message and nothing else. I'm going to say return message hello. And now this data is going to become available to the layout page, but also to your other child routes. I'm going to press Ctrl P and I'm going to find the layout in source routes. And here, if you say export let data, and we can give it a type layout data, you can see this is imported for you. And if you hover over it, you're going to see that you're going to get the message, which is awesome. So now when you output it like here, using the snippet, you're going to see message hello. So let's take this same block of code, and now we don't really need this here. Let's just remove it. So now you can go to any child routes and you're going to be able to use that data. So we can go to posts, where you have the slug, for example, to page svelte. And now if we hover over this, you should already see, here it is, the message. And now if we put it here, now when you go to a post, you should see not only the post that returned for the page, but also the message from the loader function from the layout. This is really powerful when you have some data that you want to reuse. So I'm going to show you how we can take advantage of that. Here in the post, since we don't have a page yet, we're going to create it. But basically what I want here, I want a sidebar that's going to give us a couple of posts. And on the right, I want to show the posts that we've seen so far, but also I want to recommend posts that are going to be the same as in this sidebar. And we're going to use a layout to achieve that. So you don't have to create a special file just to fetch the data for posts or whatever. But first I'm going to remove this because we don't need it. And I can just save this, and we don't even really need this file. So I'm going to find it here, and I'm just going to delete it. So first thing, I'm just going to, so I'm not blinded, I'm going to go here. Let me just collapse everything, just so we know our footing. We have source, routes. Here is our post. So remember when we visit post, nothing here. So I'm going to create a page.svelte file just to get started. So we can just say posts, and we're also going to include a paragraph. We can say you can browse posts here. And now we're also going to create a new layout. So again, under posts, plus layout.svelte, and let's just name it layout or whatever. It's really not important for now, because first we're going to fetch the data here, and you can also see if we just give it a slot, we should see everything else. But we're going to get back to this. First, let's create a plus layout.server.ts file under posts. So you can say plus layout server.ts. And why server.ts? Because we're going to talk to Prisma, of course. So let me just collab this, and we need to export a load function. Export const load. The type is layout server load. So this is going to get imported. We can say async. And again, you get the event here if you need it, just like before. And we can just say const post. So we can use Prisma. If you press enter db, it should import it for us. So we can just do it like this. And we can get post, find many, because we want everything. And now I'm going to specify the fields I want. I just do it like this. So I can say select. I don't want anything else. I just want the title. And I want the slug. I'm going to say true. And I'm going to take 4 results, nothing else. And now we just need to return the post. So I can say return post. And basically that's it. Awesome. So since we use this, now this data is going to be available through our entire /post route. So we can go to layout svelte, and I'm just going to remove everything here. I'm just going to add a script, export let data, so we can get the data. The type is going to be layout data, which should be imported like this. Awesome. Now I'm going to create a layout like this. We're going to have some basic styling. Let me just make space so it's more readable. I'm going to create an aside. Here's going to be a nav inside, h4. We're going to have posts. And now here is going to be some list. And now we're going to loop over each of those posts. So you can say each data, we have types here. Data posts, right? Data post as slug title. So sometimes this might be tricky. Here we have some posts, but in that case you can press Ctrl P. You can use the pointy boy and then restart language server, or worse, you can restart your development server and the type should be generated. TypeScript is sometimes slow, and that's how it is, because this is really complicated when you think about it, what it does under the hood, right? So if you ever have problems, maybe it's not you first, maybe it's TypeScript, so I recommend you check that. So we can say each here, and then say li. You're going to have a link here. Post is going to be slug. And this is going to be title, since we destructured it. So awesome. Here you can see we have the sidebar. Everything is good. We have our type here. All right, so now let's show everything else. Remember, we need to use slot here. This is going to show our post. Okay, so now we just need some basic styling. That's how simple this is. How awesome is this, right? So I can say display grid template columns. So I'm going to say the sidebar should be 200 pixel, not responsive. 60 characters for the post. And I want a gap of 4 rem. And then I want some spacing to rem. Let's save it, and awesome. This is a great layout. So we can see here we have it on the side. And now since we created this layout, when we load the post in, it's going to load in on the side. How awesome is this? And of course, this is not the most responsive thing. You can make it more responsive, but yeah. And I'm also zoomed in, so that's why that is. But yeah, let's just keep it zoomed in for now. So let me just give you a summary. We created a new layout for the post route, just so we have some posts here in the sidebar on the left, and just so we can load posts here. This post is coming from this file, which is /post page.svelte. So we can do whatever here. And now when we load a post, because we're using this layout where we have this slot here, now every post that we pick here is going to get loaded on the right. And this is how that works. How awesome it is. Okay, let me just zoom in just so we see everything. Okay, hope this is visible. But yeah, basically that's it. But now I also want to have recommended posts here that are going to be the same as they are here. And in our sidebar, if I go here to routes, posts, we can see here is a child route of post slug page.svelte. If we go here and hover over data, what is this? Oh, here we have the post, right? And the post itself. And here is everything that we need, right? So we don't really need to create a special file just for this plus page.svelte file where we can already reuse the data we have. So let's show the post. So you can go here, I'm going to create posts, give it a h3, post, we're going to loop over it again, ul, and then I'm going to use the snippet I have, so you can say data post as slug title, and now inside here we can do the same thing, li, we're going to give it a link, this is going to be post slug, give it a title. Awesome, now we just need some styles. If we save it, it should already work. But now let's give it some spacing here. So if I go create a style, you say post margin top to rem. Awesome, and now we reuse this data. So now let's try if everything works. So this is going to load the post and we're going to get the same recommended post. And now when we use this, it's also going to change the post, but this isn't going to change, of course. And how awesome and simple was that? Alright friends, before we get started with this next part, first let's fix this issue so it'll get cancelled. So this was in our layout post, right? So you can just say min max, we can say actually auto and max 60 characters and this should fix it. Alright, that fixed my OCD and I feel already a lot better. So let's close this and let's talk about how your data is available everywhere. So far we've seen how data flows in one direction, but the $page store makes your data available everywhere. So let's see how that works. If I press Ctrl P, I'm going to go to the root layout, which is going to be source routes. And now here I can import the store from SvelteKit, which we already seen in previous parts how useful this is. So I can say import page from $app stores. And I'm just going to output everything here. Use a store by prefixing with the $. This is just syntactic sugar, so you don't have to subscribe and unsubscribe to stores yourself. So now I can save this and you can see it's going to output it for every request. So here you're going to have these params and we also have some data, so we get posts. And remember, here are the posts from data that we return from our loaders, and here is a post. So interesting things happen when we go to a post. So you get here post and here is a post with the ID. You have created it and etc. So why is this useful? You might be confused. And basically this is really useful. Instead of repeating something like SEO on every page, you can use this page store to use it for your titles and whatever else you need. And you can overwrite it for individual pages if you want. So let's see how this can be useful. So I'm just going to remove this and I'm just going to create Svelte head here. And here is where you put whatever you need that goes in the head of the document. So we can say title, and now remember we get it from the page store, and the beautiful thing is that it's also typed. So we can say data post, and let's give it also a question mark because the post might not exist. And you're going to see we're going to update the title here when I save. So awesome, this now updates the title of the post. But of course, when you go to other parts of your site, this is going to be undefined. So you can set a default here if you want, or you can override it just for those individual pages. But now you don't need to do other complicated things to make this work. So if you see when I go to any other post, it updates the title. And this is really an awesome use case for this. Another real world example I want to show you is when you're using an auth library or doing auth yourself, you need to somehow authenticate that user. So let me just scroll down here. So remember how we said that you can return data from your load function, from your layout that is, and it's going to be available for your entire app. And here is the perfect use case for that. So of course this is more involved. You're going to first authenticate the user using hooks in SvelteKit, and then through this event you're going to get the session or the user data, whatever it is, from event locals. So you're going to get the session here, and now you can use this from your $page store anywhere in your app. So in this case for auth.js, it's returning this session, and now you can check it in your template. So here you have some file, whatever, and now you have access to the page store, and now you can make a check here if page.data session. So remember, this is the same session that you return from here. Okay, then you know the user is authenticated. And now you can display any data you want from that. So you can show the user image or whatever else you need. And this is really what this is useful for. So I'm just chilling here in our API endpoint and I'm thinking to myself, how can I make this API more flexible? When we first created this API, I honestly wouldn't have blamed you if you thought that we just did the same thing that the dummy JSON API did, but not only do we own this API, now we can make it more flexible. So let's talk about how we can use the data from the URL. First, I'm going to remove this limit here and the cache control header since we don't need this anymore. And basically, if you think about it, the URL was the first state manager before any of these fancy JavaScript frameworks existed. A stateful URL means you can use query parameters from the URL for providing options like filtering and sorting data. And SvelteKit makes it easy to work with the URL, and that's why the load function has some useful things. So we can get the URL from here, which is an instance of URL, which you can learn more about on MDN, and it has properties like origin, hostname, and pathname, and also the search params, which are going to be really useful in a second. You also get the route, which has the name of the current directory relative to source/routes. And you also have params, which is derived from url.pathname and route.id. And if you go here, you can console log it out. So you can say URL route params. Let's open the terminal. I'm going to save this. Let's rerun this. So now we can see all of these options on the URL. Here is the route, which you can get the ID, and your params have other info if you have those. But what I want to do is to improve the existing posts API so I'm able to specify the amount of posts I want and set the order. So I want something like this. I want to go to posts. I want to be able to set a limit, and I also want to be able to set an order that's descending or ascending. And basically now when we look here, we get the search params, and we don't really have to do any crazy regex or whatever to get this. It's already parsed for us. We get the limit, we get the order, and this is all thanks to the web platform again. I know, you're already tired of me mentioning the web platform, alright? So if you go to MDN, you can learn more about this here. It's the same thing, URL, search params. And you're like, okay, how do I get anything from this? Okay, has, get, all, okay, etc. Or you can be a true Chad and just use TypeScript in your project. So you can just go here, and now since we have access to this, we can create a more flexible API. So let me just close the terminal. I'm going to remove this. So we won't need params route. We're just going to need the URL. And now we just need a way to get our limit and order. So I'm going to say limit, and this is going to be URL, just URL, search params. And now we say get what we want to get, the limit. It's already parsed for us, right? Which is really awesome. And now we can set a default. If there's no limit, just return all the posts. And now we can set the order. We're going to say we'll search params again, get order, or we can set the default here. We can set ascending. And this is going to return a string, but we want a number. So we can cast it here to a number. You can go to the end, and you can just save it like this. So in our query here, let's just make some space. We're going to add some more options. Prisma has this order by options, and you can select what you want to order it by, the ID, and of course, it already has options. Since we have great auto-completion, it's ascending and descending. And of course, this is why I intentionally designed the API that way, because Prisma expects ascending or descending. And now instead of using a literal string, we can just say order, and it's going to complain about some things. Really, it's not important. We also need to specify the limit, so we can just say take, which is going to be the limit, not order. So yeah, that should work. So now if I go here, I'm going to save this, and right now nothing is happening because we need to refresh. So we should get back 4 posts, and it should be in the reverse order. It should start from 30. So let's do this, and awesome. Now we get back 30, 29, 28, 27. And the beautiful thing is that the order here doesn't really matter. So we can, for example, remove this. We can just say limit, or if you don't provide anything, it should work the same. And now let's just say order. So we can say descending. So this should give us all the posts, but in reverse order, and everything works great. So honestly, that's it for this session, but I actually want to include some bonus, which is more food for thought. So using the URL for state management is not a unique concept and something we just started rediscovering because frameworks like SvelteKit make working with the URL great again. So you're used, for example, to having component states for something like search, but you can't share the link with someone else. So here is an example of this. If I told you to make a search like this, you would probably do something similar like this, but you would use some state in your component like the search query, and that's how you would do it. But in SvelteKit and these other frameworks, what you can do
is update the search params, and the search params, when they get updated, they can rerun your load function, and this can update the data on your page. So as you can see here is an example where you don't need any client state or state in your component. This is basically just has a form and is going to trigger the search, and when the search gets updated, the data is going to get updated for the page. Of course, you don't have to understand this everything. This is, as I said, just bonus content, and something I honestly think even the SvelteKit doc should include, because this is really almost an old way but new way of thinking for people. So for example, if I go here and let's look for Angelo, and we get Angelo back, and we really had no state. And let me just also show you how this works in practice. I'm going to zoom out because this UI is honestly mind-boggling sometimes. So here's what I want. I want to open this in the new tab. So let's just go to the end. I guess I gotta copy the URL, doesn't matter. So you can see what's going to happen here. Okay, I just clicked on accident on someone. But let's search for Angelo again. And now as we typed, if you go back to URL, you can see this was updated real time. So for example, imagine if you're working on a dashboard or something, how useful this would be. And now if this was a real site, which it is of course, I can just share this URL with anyone. Like I can just copy this, I close the tab, right? Proof. Look at that confidence. Now I can just go here, leave. I guess it's going to close that, but yeah, you can see how this works. And now you can preserve your state in the URL. And I also want to give a shout out to this library, which is SvelteKit search params. This, what I showed you right now, looks a bit boilerplatey, right? But here is a great library that someone made, which makes this really easy. So look how simple this is compared to what I showed. This is even simpler. And here you can just import the query param from SvelteKit search params, and you can just update the query param like this. And there is another great example. So you can just bind the value and update it easily like this. So I think this is something really exciting and something that we just started rediscovering again if you're in the JavaScript landscape, because probably everyone else that works in PHP and those other environments are probably laughing at me right now. This one is going to be a bit brain twisty. We're going to talk about using parent layout data. So far you learned how data returned from a parent load function becomes available to plus page svelte and plus.layout svelte components over the data prop. That's great, but what if you need the parent layout data inside a child load function? In that case, you can await the data using parent. I want to emphasize that it only works if you return the data from a layout. To show this, I'm going to go to the deepest route, which is our post, so I can open the sidebar. I can go to source, routes, posts, slug, and I'm going to open the plus page.server.ts file. And now here we have access to something interesting. We have the parent method. So let me just make space. I'm going to say const parent data. I have to await it. I can say parent, and now let's log it out. Parent data. When I run this code, what do you expect to see in the output? Let me just open the terminal, and now I'm going to navigate to a post. It already preloaded the data, so we can see something interesting. It returned the posts. And if you guessed that those are the 4 posts from routes, post, layout.server.ts, you would be right, because that's the only parent layout load function that returns data so far. So we can go to post layout like this, and here it is. Here is a return the data from the load function in the layout. So I'm just going to close the terminal. Another thing you have to keep in mind is that you have to be careful to not introduce a waterfall if your data doesn't depend on the result of the parent, because load functions run in parallel. If you never heard about this, when people say waterfall, they usually mean a traffic jam in your network tab. So for example, if you request something from another load function, now that load function has to stop rendering because it has to wait for that parent data to get the data for the current load function, and then you basically get into what looks like a waterfall in the network tab. So I'm just going to close this file and open a new one just so I can show you an example. So you can pretend that, for example, this is some page server TS file, and now we export a load function like before. So we can say const load, which would be page load, for example, and now we can say async, and now we can destructure the parent. So let's do it like that. And now let me show you what I mean. So first, you would want to get the data from the parent first. In this case, you obviously can't avoid it. This is why you're using it, because you depend on the data. Now you can say parent data. You say await parent, and now we have the second step. because you need the parent data. And say data. And now you have some function, a call to a database or whatever, get data. Now we can pass it the parent data. And this is fine if you have to do it, but what the SvelteKit documentation says is that you shouldn't do this and you should await the parent last so you don't block the rendering. So basically what happens here, parent load function runs first, and we can even give it a hourglass. And then you have here this load function is now blocked because it has to wait for the results of the first one. So you can just say stop. So now you have a better idea how this can stop rendering. So here is the ideal that you should do if you don't depend on that data. So if you go here, so again, the first step, this load function fires off. So we can even give it a nice running emoji like this. We also copy this over. So you can just say const data await get data, not this, get data. And then you can say second, the parent load function fires off, const parent data await parent. And now you won't run into any blocking issues. This is going to fire off, then this is going to fire off, and now the load functions can run in parallel. As long as you keep this in mind, you should be fine. I hope you're not tired, because there's one more thing we have to talk about, and that is the secret life of load functions. You should understand how load functions work, because you're going to need to rerun a load function for the page, which SvelteKit already does for you behind the scenes in most cases, but in some cases you might want to do it yourself. And how this works is that SvelteKit tracks the dependencies of each load function to avoid having to do the same work during navigation. So for example, let's take a look at the load function for the slug, which shows our post. So if we type in slug, we're going to go here. The dependency here would be the params, so each time params.slug changes, SvelteKit is going to rerun the load function. Let's look at another example. So we can open page.ts in our routes, and what is the dependency here? The dependency here is the URL inside the fetch, so API post. If SvelteKit sees that the post data hasn't changed, it's not going to rerun this function when you navigate to other pages. And remember from the start how this goes full circle. This is why this special fetch is going to inline the response in the HTML, so it's just going to reuse it. Also, a load function that awaits the parent data from another load function will rerun if the parent load function reruns. If you need to manually rerun the load function, SvelteKit provides you some useful functions like invalidate, which you can pass a URL, or you can use invalidate all, which is going to rerun every load function, so be careful with that one. So let's look at an example here. I'm going to close this, and you can also create your own identifier. So for example, we already mentioned how this is an identifier, but you can create your own using the pens. So we can use the pens here, and you can name this whatever you want. You can go here and you can say the pens, and you can name this banana if you want or whatever, but I'm going to call it post. Or the doc show you this really neat naming convention. You can use app or whatever. I'm just going to keep it simple and name it post. I'm going to save. So I'm going to change the API slightly here because I want to show you how this affects refetching the data on the page. So what I'm going to do here is return a random number of posts. I'm just going to get a random number here. We have to say math round, and then you have to say math random times 30 because that's the amount of posts. And now here in the post, I'm going to use backticks like this. And now I'm going to say limit because remember, we enhanced our API. How cool is this? And now we can say random. So this should return a random number of posts when we revalidate this load function. And we can save it. Nothing changed, of course, beside the API. Now we get a random number of posts when you refresh the page. But we don't want to refresh the page. We just want to do it manually ourselves, invalidate the load function, and rerun the data for the page. Alright, so now we have to go to the page, which is going to be here, so source routes page. Remember here we have our post, and we're going to move it here. So what I'm now going to do below post, I'm going to create a button, and we can say rerun, and this is just going to have a function on click. We're going to name it rerun load function, and we're going to create this function right now. Function rerun load function. It's not going to have any parameters. So now I'm going to show you all the ways that you can revalidate. So the first A method, I'm going to call it, is going to use the invalidate from SvelteKit. So we need to import invalidate from app.navigation. And now the first is using, as we defined it here, the depends. This is going to be that. Let's also define a B option, which is going to be invalidate again. And now we can say API post. And caution, this isn't going to work in this case because we created a unique URL. So we really can't account for that. But in case we have a stable URL, it's going to work. All right, so let's introduce option number C, which is going to also use invalidate, but we're going to pass it a callback that takes a URL. And we can say URL ref. If it includes anything relating to post, is going to rerun it. And let's also include the last option, which is going to be invalidate all. And you should treat this as a nuclear option, so avoid this at all costs if you can. But let me just comment all of these out. Let me just save it. So when I press this button now, this should invalidate the data on the page and refresh it. So let's see if this works. Awesome. And even if you open your network tab, let's get to the network tab, you're going to see it's going to make a fetch request. You can see it does a random one each time. So now let's look at all the others. Of course, this one won't work in this case because we have a unique URL. So if I clear this out, try it won't work, but it would work if you had a stable URL. So let's see the C1. So I'm going to clear it and I'm going to refetch post. Now I'm going to use the nuclear option, invalidate all, so you can also rerun it. Let's repeat what makes a load function rerun. If any reference to a property of params or URL changes, if the load function calls a wait parent and the parent reran, if you declared a dependency with fetch or depends and mark the URL invalid with invalidate URL, or if you use the nuclear option invalidate all to force every load function to rerun. Another thing worth noting is that this doesn't cause the component to be recreated, but it just updates the data prop for the page inside your +page.svelte or +layout.svelte component. But if you want to reset the component, you can use after navigate or wrap your component in a key block. So that's everything you should know about API endpoints and loading data in SvelteKit. In the next one, we're going to learn about working with forms. If you like what you're seeing, don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you want to support me, you can find the Patreon in the description. Thank you for watching and catch you in the next one. Peace!